The bridge was still crowded when it exploded. Not with the enemy, with his own men. 30,000 French soldiers, retreating in good order across the only crossing left over the White Elster River, when the charges detonated at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Not because the Allies had seized the bridgehead, not because enemy engineers had reached the fuses, but because a single corporal, left alone at the detonator, heard Russian skirmishers firing in his direction and panicked. The Britannica account is exact on this point. The bridge went up while it was still crowded with retreating French troops and in no danger of Allied attack. Napoleon had rebuilt an army of 400,000 men from the wreckage of Russia. He had won battles at Lutzen, at Bautzen, at Dresden. He had, by virtually every measure of the military art, outgeneraled an opponent twice his size. And then he lost his German empire to one man's panic at a detonator. But here's what historians have never fully resolved. Why did Napoleon stop fighting in June of 1813 when he was winning? He had just beaten the Prussians twice in a month. The coalition was still forming. The initiative was his. This was the man who had written in his own tactical doctrine that surrendering momentum to a retreating enemy was the cardinal sin of generalship, who had built his entire career on the principle that a defeated army must be pursued until it cannot fight again. Then he stopped. His own later reflections on St. Helena called it one of the greatest blunders of his career. What he never fully explained was why he made it in the first place. There are 3 things this campaign will teach you that no summary of the Napoleonic Wars will. The strategy that defeated Napoleon wasn't invented by his enemies. It was designed by one of his own former marshals, who had served under him for 20 years and knew his psychological habits from the inside. The soldiers Napoleon sent to stop the coalition weren't soldiers in any meaningful sense. They were boys as young as 14 years old, conscripted by a decree signed by his own wife, given as little as 2 weeks of training before being marched to the front. And the volunteers who fought in this campaign wore a uniform of black, red, and gold, colors chosen for the most mundane practical reason imaginable. And those colors are flying over the Bundestag in Berlin today. And to understand why the greatest military mind of the age made the one decision that made everything else inevitable, we need to go back to December of 1812, and the moment Napoleon's largest army came home in pieces. The catastrophe began with arithmetic. On June 24, 1812, Napoleon crossed into Russia with approximately 685,000 men, the largest army assembled in European history to that point. What returned, by December of that same year, was something that defies clean summarization. The World History Encyclopedia's account captures it precisely. The Grande Armée had ceased to exist, its components buried beneath the Russian snow. Fewer than 100,000 effective combatants came back. The rest, the dead, the captured, the men who simply wandered off into the Russian countryside and never returned, represented a generation of professional military experience accumulated over more than a decade of continuous campaigning. This was not merely a numerical loss, though the numbers were catastrophic enough on their own. The Russian campaign destroyed something that Napoleon could not rebuild by issuing conscription decrees: the institutional memory of the French military. The veterans who had marched with him through Italy, through Egypt, through the German campaigns of 1805 and 1806 and 1809. The sergeants who knew how to keep a battalion moving in rain and cold. The cavalry officers who could read terrain at a gallop. The artillerists who had served the same guns through a dozen battles. These men were gone. What France had left were the living, which meant the young, which meant the inexperienced, which meant something that would shape every engagement of the year to come. The cavalry loss was the structural wound that never healed. Napoleon's horsemen had always been the nervous system of his military machine, the scouts who found enemy positions, the screens who hid French movements, the hunters who ran down retreating armies and turned tactical victories into strategic annihilation. In Russia, hundreds of thousands of trained war horses had died in the snow and cold. France could draft boys to carry muskets. It could not, on any human timescale, breed mature cavalry mounts and train their riders from scratch. As Napoleon.org documents with unusual bluntness, the hole left by the cavalry's destruction was never to be filled. Napoleon would fight the entire campaign of 1813 effectively blind, unable to gather reliable battlefield reconnaissance, unable to screen his own columns from Allied harassment, and crucially, unable to pursue defeated enemies to their destruction. He would win battles in 1813. He would not be able to convert those victories into the strategic annihilation that had always defined his method. Beyond France's borders, in the courts and chancelleries of the nations Napoleon had conquered, subjugated, or threatened into alliance, men who had spent years pretending to be his friends began writing very different letters. The perception of French invincibility, the psychological architecture that made client states pay tribute and allied monarchs hesitate, had cracked. For the first time in 20 years of revolutionary and Napoleonic warfare, the question being asked across Europe was not whether Napoleon could be beaten. The question was whether he could be beaten decisively enough, quickly enough, and by a coalition disciplined enough to stay together until the work was done. That last condition had always been the problem. Every previous coalition had assembled, fought, and fractured. Undone by bilateral suspicions, competing interests, and Napoleon's genius for exploiting diplomatic division before it could be translated into military cooperation. The coalition that would destroy him in 1813 would have to solve the coalition problem first. And it would have to do so under the pressure of a man who was already, even before the spring campaign began, rebuilding an army from nothing. On December 30th, 1812, barely weeks after the last French survivors had stumbled back from Russia, a Prussian general made a decision that was technically treason and historically inevitable. General Ludwig Yorck von Wartenberg commanded the Prussian Auxiliary Corps that had been forced to support Napoleon's Russian invasion. Without authorization from King Frederick William III, who was still technically bound to France by treaty, Yorck met with Russian General Diebitsch and signed the Convention of Tauroggen, a local armistice that effectively neutralized his Prussian forces without royal approval. The Prussian court officially condemned him. The Prussian public celebrated. Behind the government's official outrage lay a deeper reality. A nation that had been humiliated at Jena Auerstedt in 1806 and had spent 6 years under French domination was watching one general's insubordination become the spark for something that bureaucratic caution had prevented. As the reference document notes, the domestic reaction within Prussia was one of unbridled, explosive enthusiasm. The formal alliance followed. On February 28, 1813, Prussia and Russia signed the Treaty of Kalisz, establishing the military alliance that would become the Sixth Coalition's foundation. The terms were precise. Prussia ceded nearly all of its historical claims to Polish territories, and in return, Tsar Alexander I guaranteed Russian support for Prussian annexation of Saxony and substantial Rhineland territories. There is an irony embedded in that document that captures the era perfectly. The treaty that would ultimately destroy Napoleon's German Empire. This declaration of war on French cultural dominance was drafted entirely in the French language. The critical variable remained Austria. Austrian Foreign Minister Clemens von Metternich, the most sophisticated diplomatic mind of the age, had brokered the marriage between Napoleon and Archduchess Marie-Louise in 1810. binding the two empires by dynasty. He was also, as events of 1813 would prove, the architect of Napoleon's diplomatic destruction. Throughout the spring, Metternich maintained a posture of armed mediation, publicly neutral, secretly mobilizing a 200,000-man Austrian army. The treaties of Reichenbach on June 24th formalized the coalition's unified demands: dissolution of the Duchy of Warsaw, surrender of the Illyrian provinces, restoration of Prussian borders, recognition of German state independence. These were demands Napoleon could not accept without dismantling his own empire. The confrontation came on June 26th at the Marcolini Palace in Dresden. Napoleon granted Metternich an audience that lasted 9 hours, and what happened in that gallery is documented primarily through Metternich's own memoirs, a source that historians handle with care, given that Metternich wrote them years later and had every reason to present himself favorably. What his account records, and what multiple secondary sources confirm, is a meeting that deteriorated from negotiation into rage. Metternich presented the coalition's terms. Napoleon, per the account, threw his hat to the floor of the gallery, a theatrical gesture that in previous years would have sent a diplomat scrambling to retrieve it as a gesture of deference. Metternich, by his own telling, simply stared at it and refused to move. Napoleon paced and kicked the hat across the floor until he finally retrieved it himself. Whether every detail of this account is accurate, and the diplomatic verdict it represents, is not in dispute. Austria had decided, and Napoleon's performance that day confirmed it. Austria declared war on August 12, 1813. For the first time in the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, France faced every major European power simultaneously. Britain provided financial subsidies. The Reichenbach Convention had committed £2 million, distributed primarily to Russia and Prussia. Sweden contributed military forces under Crown Prince Charles John. And something that no previous coalition had managed now existed: a unified diplomatic front, codified in treaty with agreed war aims and committed resources. Napoleon had spent his career defeating coalitions by dividing them. There was nothing left to divide. The military miracle of 1813 is rarely celebrated in the way it deserves, because it was a miracle that contained its own catastrophe. In 6 months following the Russian disaster, Napoleon rebuilt the French military establishment from near nothing to a theoretical strength approaching 400,000 men in the Eastern Theater. The administrative achievement was extraordinary. The military result was an army that would fight with its heart and die with its feet. The conscription decrees came in waves. January 11th, 1813. 100,000 men from age classes that had already been partially called. January 11th again, 100,000 into the National Guard. January 11th, a third time, 150,000 men from the 1814 age class called early. By April, another 180,000 new conscripts had been authorized. And then, in October, the decree that gave these soldiers their name, signed by Empress Marie-Louise, acting as regent while Napoleon commanded in Germany, calling for 200,000 more men and lowering the physical and age standards to accept boys as young as 14 years old and men standing no more than 5 feet and 1 inch tall. The Wikipedia article dedicated specifically to these conscripts is unambiguous about what their mobilization meant in practical terms. Training periods as short as a fortnight were not uncommon, with few receiving as much as a month's training. A Colonel Favier, documented in the same source, noted that only the young Guard conscripts received genuinely adequate preparation. Napoleon himself recognized the problem well enough to request that battalions formed entirely from conscripts be kept to half the standard size. to allow better supervision by experienced officers and sergeants. That request is its own quiet testament to what he was working with. Yet the testimony from the campaign itself complicates any simple narrative of hopeless incompetence. Napoleon.org, one of the most reliable specialized sources for this period, states directly that the Marie-Louises and 1813 recruits would fight with a tenacity which did them credit, whether at Lutzen, Bautzen, Dresden, Kulm, or Leipzig itself. Their failure was not of spirit, but of body. The physical stamina required for Napoleon's characteristic forced marches, the tactical sophistication needed to reform broken formations without direct officer supervision, the immune resistance to the epidemic diseases that swept through the dense, unsanitary camps of the assembled armies. Contemporary sources in the campaign, including the paleo-microbiological research cited in the reference document, have identified multiple pathogens circulating through the armies of 1813: typhus, paratyphoid fever, relapsing fever, in concentrations severe enough that disease casualties rivaled battle casualties throughout the campaign. Boys who had trained for 2 weeks were marching into this, in all weathers, with supply lines that couldn't keep up. The cavalry crisis, as established above, was permanent and irreplaceable, but accounts from the campaign record Napoleon as remarking. The quote attributed to him in multiple French military histories, though its precise original source is debated among historians, that after Lutzen, these animals have learned something. The remark, wherever it originated, captured a genuine reality. The Prussian military that returned to the field in 1813 was not the army Napoleon had humiliated at Jena-Auerstedt 7 years before. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau had implemented universal military service. The Landwehr, the national militia that would provide much of the Allied numerical advantage, fought with a ferocious patriotic motivation that professional troops hired for other men's wars rarely possessed. Napoleon had rebuilt an army. His opponents had rebuilt themselves. And in the war now beginning, one of those rebuilds was going to matter more than the other. Jean-Baptiste Bernadot was born a French commoner in Pau in 1763. He rose through the Revolutionary Wars to become one of Napoleon's original marshals, one of 18 men elevated to that rank when Napoleon created it in 1804. He was also Napoleon's brother-in-law, married to Désirée Clary, who had previously been engaged to Napoleon himself and whose sister was married to Napoleon's brother Joseph. Their relationship was long, complicated, and marred by at least one serious professional rupture. A dispute with Marshal Davout regarding Bernadot's failure to support him at the Battle of Auerstedt in 1806. A failure that remained bitterly contested between them for years. In 1810, the Swedish Parliament elected Bernadot as Crown Prince, a remarkable development by any measure, in which a French commoner who had spent his career fighting Sweden's traditional enemies was offered the succession to its throne. Bernadot accepted, converted to Lutheranism, learned Swedish, and completely internalized his new national identity. When the moment came to choose between the emperor he had served and the nation he now led, the choice was not difficult. Sweden's geopolitical interests required Napoleon's defeat. Bernadot aligned with the coalition. He brought something to that alignment that no Austrian or Russian or Prussian general could provide: 20 years of intimate first-hand knowledge of how Napoleon thought, not knowledge of French military doctrine in general, but specific understanding of Napoleon's psychological tendencies, his characteristic impatiences, his patterns of exploitation, and the structural dependencies that made his system work brilliantly when he was present and collapse when he was absent. When the coalition's monarchs convened at Trachenberg Castle in Silesia in July of 1813, Bernadot was the intellectual architect of what they produced. The Wikipedia article on the German campaign of 1813 states this explicitly. The Trachenberg Plan was authored primarily by Bernadot, with contributions from Austrian Chief of Staff Radetzky and Russian General Toll. The plan's core insight was both simple and radical. Previous coalitions had tried to defeat Napoleon by fighting him, but every one of them had failed. The Trachenberg Protocol therefore established a doctrine of deliberate avoidance. Whenever Napoleon personally advanced against one of the three coalition armies, that army was under strict orders to retreat, refusing battle, drawing him further from his supply base and logistical center at Dresden. Simultaneously, the other two Allied armies were mandated to advance immediately, not against Napoleon himself, but against the detached French corps commanded by his marshals. The plan's authors had correctly identified the critical vulnerability. Napoleon's subordinates were outstanding soldiers when operating under his direct supervision. They were systematically inferior commanders when operating independently. The Trachenberg Protocol was designed to exploit precisely that gap, unbleeding the French army through the defeat of its component parts while never giving Napoleon the direct, decisive engagement where his genius operated. Three armies implemented this doctrine. The Army of Bohemia, 225,000 Austrians and Russians under Prince Schwarzenberg, threatened from the south. The Army of Silesia, 95,000 Prussians and Russians under the 71-year-old Blücher, applied pressure from the east. The Army of the North, between 120,000 and 135,000 Swedes, Russians, Prussians, and North German troops, operated from Berlin under Bernadot himself. Each was multinational by design, forcing cooperation between member nations that might otherwise pursue separate agendas. Each had a specific role, and each was governed by the same central rule: defeat his marshals. Never fight him directly. Wait for the numbers to become insurmountable. The man who had spent 20 years obeying Napoleon's orders had just written the strategic architecture that would destroy him. Napoleon later called it one of the greatest blunders of his career. He made it when he was winning. The spring campaign of 1813 had produced two French victories in rapid succession. At Lutzen on May 2nd, Napoleon's army engaged the combined Russo-Prussian forces under Wittgenstein and Blücher and forced them from the field, inflicting approximately 22,000 casualties. At Bautzen on May 20th and 21st, Napoleon executed a more complex operation: frontal assaults to fix the Allied center, while Marshal Ney's corps executed a flanking movement that threatened the Allied right. The frontal assault succeeded. Ney's flanking movement failed, not because of Allied resistance, but because of Ney's own decision to attack a specific village rather than execute the deep envelopment Napoleon had ordered. The Allies escaped again, in good order, having lost perhaps 20,000 more men. Both victories were real. Both were incomplete. And the incompleteness in each case had the same cause. Without cavalry to pursue defeated enemies, Napoleon could win the ground, but could not destroy the army standing on it. The Allied forces retreated intact after both engagements, reorganized, and returned to the field. Napoleon had demonstrated tactical superiority. He had not achieved strategic annihilation. What followed was the armistice of Pleswitz, effective June 4th, 1813, and subsequently extended until August 13th. Napoleon's military logic for accepting it was not unreasonable on its face. His army was genuinely exhausted. The Wikipedia article on the War of the Sixth Coalition notes that the French were in dire need of a period of reconstruction and recuperation. His cavalry shortage remained critical. His young conscripts were physically deteriorating from the campaign's pace. The armistice offered time to bring up horses from France, rest the infantry, resupply the artillery. In isolation, those were legitimate military requirements. And the catastrophic error was in the assumption that Napoleon would gain more from the pause than the coalition would. This assumption was wrong in every dimension. The coalition used the 6 weeks to complete Austrian mobilization, the decisive factor that would transform a manageable two-front war into an encirclement. British subsidies, formalized at Reichenbach in June, began flowing to Russia and Prussia at scale. The Prussian Landwehr completed its initial training cycle. The Trachenberg Conference produced its operational plan. What Napoleon received from 6 weeks of armistice was a modest cavalry reinforcement and some additional conscripts. What the coalition received was Austria, 200,000 additional soldiers, and the completion of the strategic encirclement that Trachenberg had designed. The Metternich meeting at the Marcolini Palace on June 26th occurred during the armistice. Napoleon negotiating, or attempting to negotiate, his way out of the strategic corner he had already allowed to form around him. His words that day, as Metternich's account records them, reveal something of his understanding of his own position. My domination will not survive me. From the day I ceased to be strong and therefore feared. Whatever the precise accuracy of that quotation. And Metternich's memoirs require careful handling, given the author's obvious interest in portraying himself as the calm diplomat against Napoleon's theatrical rage. The sentiment captures a real strategic reality. Napoleon's power was entirely performance-based. An emperor who negotiated from weakness was no longer performing strength, and an emperor who was not performing strength had nothing. When the armistice expired on August 13th, Austria declared war on France. Napoleon now faced every major European power simultaneously, for the first time in his career. 6 weeks of pause had converted a manageable military situation into an existential one. The marshal who never surrendered initiative had surrendered it at the moment when it mattered most. From the outside, Napoleon's autumn campaign looked like a demonstration of operational mastery. He held the central position at Dresden, moving rapidly along interior lines to strike at approaching coalition armies before they could unite. He won the Battle of Dresden on August 26th and 27th against Schwarzenberg's Army of Bohemia, inflicting approximately 40,000 coalition casualties against his own 10,000. His last great tactical triumph in Germany, and by any measure, a brilliant defensive performance. From the inside, the campaign was disintegrating. The Trachenberg plan executed precisely as its authors had designed. Whenever Napoleon moved aggressively against one Allied army, that army retreated, drawing him further from his supply base, exhausting his young conscripts on forced marches through summer heat and autumn rain, wasting cavalry he didn't have on reconnaissance that produced nothing. Whenever he turned to face a different threat, the army he had been pursuing stopped retreating and resumed advancing. He chased Blücher east. Schwarzenberg moved on Dresden. He turned south to defend Dresden. Blücher reversed course. The result was perpetual motion that killed more men through march and disease than through battle, without producing the decisive engagement that Napoleon needed to break the coalition structure. On the periphery, his marshals faced the coalition alone, and the Trachenberg Protocol destroyed them, one by one, over 6 weeks. On August 23rd, Marshal Oudinot, assigned to seize the Prussian capital of Berlin with 60,000 men, was defeated at Grossbeeren by Bernadot's Army of the North, losing approximately 3,000 men. 3 days later, on August 26th, the same day Napoleon was winning at Dresden, Marshal MacDonald attempted to engage Blücher in Silesia. Blücher lured him across the Katzbach River during a torrential rainstorm and counterattacked. The flooding river, the broken ground, and the Prussian assault combined to produce catastrophe. MacDonald lost approximately 30,000 men, many of them drowned in the current. The reference document identifies the Katzbach as the single most damaging of the 4 Marshal defeats. On August 29th and 30th, General von Damme, pursuing the retreating Austrians from Dresden too aggressively and without adequate support, was cut off in the valley at Kulm, surrounded and forced to surrender with approximately 25,000 men, himself among the prisoners. And on September 6th, Marshal Ney, replacing the defeated Oudinot and making a second attempt on Berlin with 58,000 troops, was shattered at Dennewitz by Bernadot's forces and the Prussian General von Bülow, losing approximately 22,000 men. 4 battles. Approximately 80,000 French soldiers lost. Not one of them fought by Napoleon himself. Dresden, the one place he had been present, had produced a brilliant victory. His generals, operating independently exactly as the Trachenberg plan had anticipated and designed for, had produced 80,000 casualties in 6 weeks. The structural flaw in Napoleon's command architecture, which had been masked for years by his physical presence on the decisive battlefield, had been exposed and systematically exploited by a plan written by a man who had spent 20 years watching that architecture from the inside. By early October, Bavaria, once Napoleon's most reliable German ally, had formally defected to the coalition. Its armies were now moving toward the Rhine, threatening the communications back to France. Napoleon was not merely facing 3 approaching coalition armies. His logistical lifeline was being severed behind him. He had one remaining option: concentrate everything at Leipzig, hold the central position, and hope that the mathematics of genius could overcome the mathematics of overwhelming numbers. He arrived at Leipzig with approximately 180,000 to 200,000 men. 3 coalition armies, totaling more than 300,000 and growing, were converging from 3 directions, and he had prepared exactly 1 bridge for the army's retreat. Before a single shot was fired at Leipzig, the terrain had already made one decision for Napoleon. He simply hadn't recognized it yet. Leipzig sits at the confluence of 4 rivers: the Elster, the Pleiss, the Lupe, and the Party, and the city itself is encircled by their tributaries and by the marshy, low-lying ground their confluences create. To the west, the only viable approach to France ran along an elevated causeway, the Lindenau Road, crossing the White Elster River via a single stone bridge. This was not a choice Napoleon had made. It was a geographic fact. But what he chose to do with that geographic fact, or rather, what he chose not to do, would determine whether 190,000 men had an escape route or a cage. Napoleon mined the bridge for demolition. His explicit orders designated the charges as a last resort, to be detonated only after the entire army, including the rearguard, had crossed safely to the western bank. He posted engineers at the bridgehead. He did not construct alternative crossings. Napoleon's impressions, a specialized Napoleonic analysis resource, identifies this as his most consequential error at Leipzig. His biggest mistake was his failure to prepare adequately for the retreat, leaving a single bridge over the Elster as the only avenue for withdrawal. An army of nearly 200,000 men, engaged in a 4-day battle against an encircling force, was betting its survival on one mined bridge, and one set of detonation orders passed down a chain of command. The French deployment reflected Napoleon's offensive intention. He positioned 3 corps south of Leipzig to face Schwarzenberg's approaching army of Bohemia. Poniatowski's Polish 8th Corps held Konowitz on the right. Marshal Victor's corps anchored Wachau at the center, and Lauriston's command extended between Wachau and Liebert-Volkwitz to the left. The Young Guard waited behind Lauriston as tactical reserve. To the north, Marshals Ney and Marmont prepared to hold against Blücher's army of Silesia. Bertrand's Fourth Corps was detached to hold Lindenau, the western escape road, against any Austrian flanking force. Napoleon himself planned to observe from a central position, committing his reserves at the moment of decision in the south. His operational concept was rational, given his intelligence. Defeat Schwarzenberg's army of Bohemia before Blücher and Bernadot could close from the north and east. The three coalition armies were not yet unified. If he could strike decisively in the south before the other two armies arrived, the strategic arithmetic might still be survivable. The flaw was in the intelligence. On the morning of October 16, 1813, a mist lay across the fields south of Leipzig as the artillery of both sides began unlimbering. Napoleon believed Blücher was still a comfortable distance to the north and east. He was planning a sequential battle, south first, then north. What he was actually going to get, as the historyofwar.org detailed Day 1 analysis documents, was something closer to simultaneous. Blücher's army of Silesia arrived and opened its own assault at 10 o'clock in the morning, far earlier than Napoleon had anticipated. The mist lifted to reveal not one front, but two. At approximately 9 o'clock in the morning on October 16, 1813, the artillery opened on both sides of Leipzig simultaneously. What followed over the next 6 hours was one of the most complex, bloody, and are nearly decisive days in the entire history of Napoleonic warfare. A day when Napoleon came closer to winning than anyone who was not present on that field could have predicted. The southern sector bore the first weight of the fighting. Schwarzenberg's army of Bohemia advanced in multiple columns toward the villages of Markkleeberg, Wachau, and Liebert-Volkwitz. The Malavus.com analysis describes the fighting for Wachau, defended by Marshal Victor's corps, as extremely violent, with the village changing hands multiple times through the morning. Poniatowski's Polish corps at Konowitz held against repeated Austrian assaults with a tenacity that accounts from both sides noted. Marshal Augereau's corps, initially positioned in reserve, was moved to support the right as Austrian pressure intensified. The fighting was close quarters, a village by village, with artillery playing the dominant role on both sides. By approximately 11:30 in the morning, the French had absorbed the initial Allied assault and were beginning to push back along the southern front. Napoleon recognized the moment. At approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he committed his primary counterattack. Marshal Murat, with approximately 10,000 to 12,000 French, Italian, and Saxon cavalry. Sources vary between 10,000 and 12,000. With the Wikipedia Battle of Leipzig article and the Napoleon.org analysis giving different figures. Supported by divisions of the Young Guard, launched the most ambitious cavalry assault of the day toward the Allied center. The charge shattered Russian infantry formations. It captured several coalition artillery batteries. It penetrated so deeply into the Allied position that Napoleon's impression states directly. Without the intervention of the Russian guards, whom Alexander had prevailed upon Schwarzenberg to bring closer, the Allied monarchs themselves might have been captured. 3 emperors and a king, Alexander I of Russia, Francis I of Austria, Frederick William III of Prussia, and the Swedish monarch's representative, were present on that field. The Russian Guards reserves, positioned closer than Schwarzenberg had initially intended as a result of Alexander's personal insistence before the battle began, stopped the French penetration. Murat's formation choice had also been suboptimal. Wikipedia notes that his use of massive columns rather than smaller mobile formations made his cavalry more vulnerable to Allied counter-harassment. But the charge remained the closest Napoleon came to a war-winning breakthrough at Leipzig. The northern problem arrived at the worst possible moment. Blücher's army of Silesia, operating on the Trachenberg Protocol's timeline rather than Napoleon's preferred schedule, attacked Marmont's 6th Corps at Mokern from 10 o'clock onward, hours before Napoleon's main southern assault had developed. The Prussians fought with what the historyofwar.org analysis characterizes as relentless determination, striking repeatedly at Marmont's positions until forcing him steadily back toward the city outskirts. Napoleon found himself defending two fronts simultaneously, a condition the Trachenberg plan had been specifically designed to create. Bertrand's corps had to hold Lindenau against Austrian pressure from the west, further draining Napoleon's operational reserves. The 2 o'clock counterattack in the south, the moment Napoleon called the decisive moment, came with less support than it needed, and stopped short of the breakthrough it required. By nightfall, the battle's first day ended as a draw. The French had held their ground in the south. The Prussians had forced significant French withdrawal in the north. Neither side had broken, and overnight, the mathematics changed decisively. Bennigsen's Army of Poland and elements of Bernadot's Army of the North arrived at the coalition lines. By morning, on October 17th, when the force arrayed against Napoleon had grown past 300,000. October 17th, 1813, was the quietest day of the Battle of Leipzig, and in certain respects, the most consequential. The scale of the previous day's fighting left both armies severely exhausted and bloodied. Schwarzenberg waited for reinforcements from the Dresden road. Blücher waited for Bernadot to close the gap in the north. Along the Leipzig perimeter, small skirmishes erupted and subsided without producing significant movement. The major engagements that had defined October 16th simply did not resume. Napoleon recognized the arithmetic before it was fully assembled against him. The coalition's advantage, already substantial on day one, was now compounding with every hour. Sometime in the afternoon of October 17th, he acted on the only non-military option remaining. He released a captured Austrian general, Count Merveldt, who had been taken prisoner in the fighting at the Pleswitz River during the first day. He sent Merveldt across the lines to the Allied monarchs, carrying a peace offer. Napoleon would retreat behind the Rhine River in exchange for a negotiated settlement. The coalition could, in effect, have what it claimed to want: French withdrawal from Germany, without further bloodshed. The Allied monarchs did not reply. Not formally, not diplomatically, not through any channel. The offer was received and ignored. As the Napoleon-Empire.org analysis observes, the coalition understood that time and numbers were now working entirely in their favor. Why accept a negotiated half-victory when a complete one was assembling itself on the roads to Leipzig? The silence was its own answer, and Napoleon would have understood what it meant. What he apparently did not know, and what Napoleon-Empire.org documents as a critical intelligence failure, was that Bavaria had formally defected to the coalition on October 8th, 9 days earlier. Bavarian armies were already moving toward the Rhine. The communications between France and the Leipzig army were not merely threatened. They were actively being severed. Napoleon was fighting to hold a position whose strategic basis had already been undermined. He had a city, not a strategy. The reinforcement mathematics made October 18th inevitable. By nightfall on October 17th, the coalition forces surrounding Leipzig had grown to exceed 300,000 men. Blücher and Bernadot's forces had closed sufficiently to complete the northern encirclement. Napoleon's force, reduced by day one casualties and unable to receive significant reinforcements, stood at approximately 175,000. The odds, which had been approximately 1.5 to 1 against him on day one, had shifted past 2 to 1 against him before the second major day of fighting had begun. He had one resource left: the darkness of October 17th. When the 18th came, it came with 300,000 enemies and 20,000 artillery rounds. That last figure matters. By the end of fighting on October 18th, per the Wikipedia Battle of Leipzig article, the French army would have approximately 20,000 artillery rounds remaining for an army of 175,000 men engaged against forces twice their size. At Leipzig, Napoleon's army was not going to run out of courage. It was going to run out of ammunition. At approximately 9 o'clock in the morning on October 18th, 1813, before the main Allied assault of the day had fully developed, something happened in the French lines at Ponsdorf that no military doctrine had prepared Napoleon to face. Approximately 5,400 Saxon soldiers, who had been positioned in the French eastern sector under General Reynier, stopped firing at the approaching coalition forces. They turned around, and they opened fire on Napoleon. The World History Encyclopedia confirms both the timing and the number. The Saxon troops defected at approximately 9 o'clock, joining the coalition with their artillery intact and immediately turning their guns against the French positions they had just vacated. The Württemberg cavalry made the same choice within hours of the Saxon infantry. The combined defections tore a significant gap in the French eastern perimeter at precisely the moment when the Allied assault was pressing from all directions simultaneously. The question of whether this was premeditated has occupied historians ever since. By the Napoleon-Empire.org analysis, one of the most careful specialized sources for Napoleonic history, states directly that the betrayal does not appear to have been premeditated. Its explanation is more human than conspiratorial. The Saxons had watched casualty rates in some regiments reach 30% over the preceding days. They were dying for a cause they had been conscripted into rather than chosen, in a war that most of them understood was already lost. They were also responding to a proclamation that Bernadot, who had commanded the Saxon troops at the Battle of Wagram in 1809 and retained their affection, had issued specifically calling on them to rejoin their former commander. Whether the defection was planned or spontaneous, the timing suggests an army that had been weighing its options for days and made its collective decision when the moment felt right. The tactical impact was immediate and severe. The gap created in the eastern French perimeter allowed Allied forces to push through toward Ponsdorf and Schönefeld, threatening the coherence of Napoleon's eastern defenses at a moment when he had no reserves available to plug it. General Reynier witnessed the defection, but could not recover the situation. The Württemberg cavalry's simultaneous departure compounded the chaos in that sector. And the psychological impact on French troops throughout the perimeter was perhaps greater than the tactical. Soldiers who had been fighting alongside men they considered allies watched those same men wheel their artillery and begin killing them. And Napoleon had promoted Joseph Poniatowski to the rank of Marshal d'Empire on the night of October 17th to 18th. The only time in the history of the French Empire that Napoleon elevated someone to marshal rank during active combat. Poniatowski, per Wikipedia's account, swore he would fight to the last. He was keeping that oath in the southern sector, holding the Konowitz position against Austrian assault, while the Saxons turned their guns in the east. By nightfall on October 18th, the French lines had been compressed toward the city itself. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. Both wings had been severely damaged. The defection had shattered whatever coherence remained in the eastern sector. Napoleon, observing from his command post at the Quant Mill, understood what the day's accounting meant. Then he gave orders for a general retreat to begin in the early morning hours of October 19th. The bridge over the White Elster was waiting. Józef Antoni Poniatowski came to Leipzig as a Polish prince and one of Napoleon's most trusted commanders. He left it as a symbol of Polish sacrifice, of military honor, and of what it means to keep an oath when keeping it is fatal. He was the nephew of Stanisław August Poniatowski, the last king of Poland, the nation that had been partitioned out of existence by Russia, Prussia, and Austria in 1795. For Poniatowski personally, Napoleon was not merely an emperor to serve. He was the man who might restore what had been taken. The Duchy of Warsaw, established under Napoleon's protection in 1807, represented the closest thing to Polish statehood that had existed in over a decade. Poniatowski commanded Polish forces under the French banner not as a mercenary serving foreign ambitions, but as a patriot serving his nation's best surviving hope. He had led that Polish corps through the entire German campaign of 1813 with consistent distinction. At Leipzig, from October 16th onward, his forces held the southern sector around Poniatowski against repeated Austrian assaults. The Poles defended positions that other formations had already abandoned, counterattacked when the tactical situation required it, and maintained their coherence under the kind of sustained, multi-directional pressure that destroys poorly trained troops and merely damages good ones. The World History Encyclopedia notes that the Poles fought with desperate bravery throughout the engagement. Accounts from both sides treated their performance at Leipzig as exceptional. On the night of October 17th to 18th, Napoleon summoned Poniatowski and promoted him to Marshal d'Empire. The timing was extraordinary. A battlefield promotion to the highest military rank, during a battle that was already effectively lost, under artillery fire that had continued intermittently through the night. Napoleon had elevated 18 men to marshal rank over the course of his career. Poniatowski was the only foreigner among them, the only non-French-born officer Napoleon ever trusted with that distinction. Wikipedia's account is specific on this point. Poniatowski swore that he would fight to the last stand. He kept that oath for 2 more days. On October 19th, as the general retreat began and the bulk of the French army crossed westward over the White Elster, Poniatowski commanded the rearguard in Leipzig's southern districts with several hundred Polish survivors. The World History Encyclopedia's account of October 19th describes block-by-block fighting through the city's streets as Allied forces broke through the gates from multiple directions. Poniatowski's men held each position as long as ammunition allowed, then fell back to the next. The fighting was of the kind that dissolves formations and kills individuals. The fact that any coherent rearguard continued to function reflected something beyond professional training. When the bridge exploded at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Poniatowski was on the wrong bank, when he was already suffering multiple severe wounds. Sustained over 3 days of fighting in the southern sector. The Elster ran fast and cold and deep at that point. He spurred his horse into the river. The horse was unable to scale the steep, muddy far bank. Marshal Józef Poniatowski, the only foreigner Napoleon had ever made a marshal, the man who had sworn 2 days earlier to fight to the last stand, drowned in the White Elster River on October 19th, 1813. Marshal MacDonald crossed the same river that same afternoon by shedding his uniform and swimming. 2 men, the same river, the same impossible situation. Different fates. History doesn't explain why. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon on October 19th, 1813, the retreat of Napoleon's army from Leipzig was proceeding in good order, and the main body had crossed. The rearguard was still fighting in the city streets. The bridge over the White Elster remained intact. Then a corporal, left alone at the detonator, made a decision. The setup for this catastrophe had been laid over days. Napoleon had ordered the Lindenau road bridge mined for demolition weeks before the battle, as a standard precautionary measure. His explicit orders were unambiguous. The charges were to be detonated only after the entire army, including the rearguard, had crossed safely to the western bank. The officer in charge of the demolition team was Colonel de Montfort, sometime in the early afternoon of October 19th, with the rearguard still fighting and the bridge still crowded, Louis de Montfort left his post. The Napoleon-Empire.org account documents that he left to assess the status of the troops still in the city, delegating the detonation responsibility to a subordinate. A single corporal remained with the fuses. Russian and Prussian skirmishers began approaching the bridgehead, firing sporadically in its direction. The Britannica account is as precise as the history allows. The bridge was blown at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, while it was still crowded with retreating French troops and in no danger of Allied attack. Encyclopedia.com's account of the same moment records a French corporal, incredibly left in charge of blowing up the Elster Bridge, panicked. The World History Encyclopedia captures the physical reality. Pieces of bridge, wagons, and body parts were blown into the air. Some accounts have attempted to identify the corporal by name, but no identification has been established to historian satisfaction across the mainstream scholarly literature. He remains, in the historical record, simply a corporal who panicked. Napoleon arrested Colonel de Montfort following the battle and formally blamed him for leaving his post. But as Napoleon's impressions and multiple other analyses observe, the deeper responsibility belonged to the decision to concentrate an army of 190,000 men behind a single-mined bridge without alternative crossings. A command failure that predated the corporal's moment by weeks. Approximately 30,000 French soldiers were trapped on the wrong side of the river. The Britannica, Wikipedia, US and World History Encyclopedia all give this figure consistently. What happened to those 30,000 men in the hours that followed was documented by War History Online with unusual directness. Those who refused to surrender barricaded themselves into whatever buildings they could and fought on in pockets of desperate last stands until they ran out of ammunition. Almost all of them were slaughtered. Others attempted to swim the White Elster, a river running fast, deep, and cold under October skies, while Allied infantry fired from the banks. Several thousand attempted this. Most failed. The distinction between MacDonald, who swam to safety, and Poniatowski, who drowned, captures in two names what 30,000 men experienced in aggregate. Napoleon had commanded the largest army France had ever fielded. He had won 50 major engagements. He had built an empire stretching from the Atlantic to the borders of Russia. In the end, the decision that destroyed his German empire was not made in a general's tent or an emperor's palace. It was made at a detonator by a man whose name history hasn't preserved, who heard shots in his direction and pulled the lever. Napoleon himself was already on the western bank when it happened. He learned of the bridge's destruction almost immediately. What he said in that moment, if anything was recorded, has not been preserved. What is preserved is the arithmetic. 70,000 survivors would eventually cross the Rhine. 400,000 had campaigned. The accounting that followed Leipzig was of a kind that belongs to a different category of human experience than battlefield statistics normally occupy. The battle's immediate casualty figures, as established by the consensus of Britannica, Wikipedia, and the Encyclopedia.com scholarly assessment, are as follows. The French sustained approximately 38,000 killed and wounded in the 4 days of combat, with an additional 30,000 captured as a direct result of the bridge's premature destruction. Total French losses at Leipzig itself, approximately 68,000 men. The coalition, attacking prepared positions from multiple directions over 4 days, sustained approximately 54,000 killed and wounded. By any measure, ratio, scale, are a strategic consequence. Leipzig was the most catastrophic military defeat Napoleon had personally overseen. But Leipzig was only the final accounting of a campaign. Encyclopedia.com's analysis of the entire German campaign of 1813 estimates total French losses at approximately 400,000 men across all causes: battle casualties, the bridge disaster, disease, desertion, and the isolation of garrison troops in fortresses across Germany and Poland. That last category is often forgotten in the immediate drama of Leipzig itself. Approximately 100,000 French soldiers remained garrisoned across Germany and Poland when Napoleon retreated. Cut off without relief, without resupply, and without any prospect of rescue. Encyclopedia.com states their fate precisely. Isolated without any prospect of relief, they eventually capitulated. They were not casualties of Leipzig. They were consequences of it. The retreat to France was simultaneously a military operation and a medical catastrophe. Napoleon crossed the Rhine at Mainz in early November with approximately 70,000 survivors of what had been a 400,000-man campaign force. The diseases that had been circulating through the armies of 1813, typhus, paratyphoid fever, relapsing fever, the overlapping pathogen complex documented in the paleomicrobiological research referenced in the supporting materials, continued their work on the retreating columns. Men who had survived 4 days of combat at Leipzig died on the roads to the Rhine from infections contracted in the autumn mud of Saxony. The Battle of Hanau, fought on October 30th and 31st, produced Napoleon's last victory of the campaign. Bavarian forces, his former allies, now under coalition command, had moved to block the French retreat route. Napoleon fought through them with characteristic tactical efficiency, demonstrating that his ability to read and exploit a battlefield had not diminished. That was the bitter irony of Hanau. Even at the end, even with 70,000 survivors of a shattered army, he was still the most dangerous battlefield commander in Europe. He was fighting through his former allies on the road home. The civilian cost at Leipzig itself is documented with unusual precision by the city's own official records. A typhus epidemic broke out in the immediate aftermath of the battle, as 4 days of combat at the scale of Leipzig left disease conditions that the city's medical infrastructure could not contain. Approximately 10% of Leipzig's population died in the epidemic that followed. People who had nothing to do with Napoleon's ambitions, who had simply had the misfortune to live at the confluence of 4 rivers where the roads to France happened to run, paid for the campaign with lives proportional to the soldiers' losses. Napoleon crossed the Rhine with 70,000 men. He would fight one more campaign. The 6 Days Campaign in the spring of 1814 were perhaps the greatest display of tactical genius in his entire military career, fought with scraps of an army against overwhelming odds in defense of French soil itself. Military historians who study that campaign are unanimous. It was brilliant. It changed nothing. Leipzig had already decided. The political consequences of Leipzig did not wait for diplomats to arrange them. They began the moment Napoleon retreated across the Rhine, and they cascaded through the established order of European politics with a speed that reflected how thoroughly that order had depended on the perception of French permanence. The Confederation of the Rhine, the League of German client states that had been the institutional expression of French hegemony in Central Europe since 1806, on providing troops and resources to every French campaign since its creation, dissolved immediately and completely. The member states that had not already defected before or during Leipzig did so in the days and weeks that followed. Bavaria had gone on October 8th. Württemberg followed. The princes and dukes who had calculated French permanence into their political survival now calculated their futures in the opposite direction. The King of Saxony, Frederick Augustus I, paid the highest price of any of Napoleon's German allies. He had remained loyal longer than strategic logic justified. His territory was occupied by the Grande Armée throughout the battle, leaving him limited options regardless of his preferences. He became a prisoner of war when Leipzig fell and was held by the coalition for months. At the Congress of Vienna that followed Napoleon's abdication, Prussia extracted approximately 2/3 of Saxony as the territorial price for Frederick Augustus's loyalty to France. The man who had been Napoleon's most steadfast German supporter lost most of his kingdom as a consequence. The isolated garrison troops scattered across Germany and Poland faced the inevitable mathematics of their situation without the drama of battle. Approximately 100,000 French soldiers sat in fortresses that Napoleon could not relieve, receiving no resupply, watching Allied forces consolidate control of the surrounding territories. They surrendered or starved over months, in a process that the historical record treats as an administrative tidying up rather than a military operation. Because that is essentially what it was. The coalition armies crossed the Rhine into France, beginning in December of 1813, applying to French territory the same operational logic that the Trachenberg Plan had applied to German territory. In the winter and spring of 1814, Napoleon executed what many military historians consider the most impressive tactical defense of his career. The 6 Days Campaign of February, a series of successive victories against Blücher's overextended army of Silesia that demonstrated his operational art completely intact. The French won at Champaubert on February 10th, at Montmirail on February 11th, at Château-Thierry on February 12th, at Vauchamp on February 14th. 6 days of combat, 4 battles, each one a tactical triumph. They did not change the strategic outcome. Schwarzenberg's army of Bohemia was still operating, larger than Napoleon's entire force. Bernadot's army of the north was still intact. The coalition's numerical advantage was so enormous that Napoleon's local victories, however brilliant, could not prevent the progressive compression of French defensive space. Paris fell on March 31st, 1814. Napoleon abdicated on April 6th. Some accounts give April 11th for the final formal document, and was exiled to the island of Elba. The First French Empire, which had defined the political geography of Europe for a decade, ceased to exist. The Congress of Vienna, convening in September of 1814, redrawn the European map. It created the German Confederation to replace the dissolved Napoleonic Confederation of the Rhine, a framework that would eventually evolve through the revolutions of 1848, through the wars of German unification in the 1860s, through catastrophes none of the Vienna delegates could have imagined, into the state structure of modern Central Europe. Leipzig had made all of it possible by making all that preceded it impossible to sustain. Here is the most unlikely consequence of the Battle of Leipzig. The national flag of the Federal Republic of Germany has its origin in a practical decision about clothing dye made by volunteers in 1813 who couldn't afford proper uniforms. The Lützow Free Corps was officially sanctioned in February of 1813 by Scharnhorst, the Prussian military reformer, and commanded by Major Ludwig Adolf Wilhelm von Lützow, a veteran of previous resistance to French occupation. Its founding concept was nationalist in the deepest sense of the word. It recruited volunteers from across all the German states, regardless of their home principality or dynastic allegiance, explicitly intending to create a German force rather than a Prussian or Saxon or Bavarian one. The reference document's account establishes its composition: primarily craftsmen and laborers, with a significant minority, approximately 12%, of academics, students, and writers, whose cultural prominence gave the unit a visibility beyond its military significance. Among those writers was Karl Theodor Körner, a dramatist and poet whose patriotic verses captured something of the ideological temperature of 1813. Le Kerner joined the Lützow Free Corps and was killed near Gadebusch in August of 1813, 22 years old. His poetry collection, Lyre and Sword, published posthumously, made him a national martyr, an intellectual who had not merely written about sacrifice, but enacted it. The educator Friedrich Froebel, who would later create the concept of the kindergarten, also served in the Corps. The poet Joseph von Eichendorff. Men whose names endured not through military distinction, but through cultural production, who happened also to have carried weapons in a forest in 1813. The uniform was practical necessity, transformed into historical accident. Without centralized funding, the volunteers dyed their own civilian clothing black, the most available uniform color that would mask the varied origins and conditions of the garments. The resulting tunics were accented with red facings on the collars and cuffs, and raised brass or gold buttons. The color combination was not designed, it was arrived at. And it happened to evoke, as the reference document notes, the heraldic colors of the defunct Holy Roman Empire, a black eagle with red beak and claws on a gold shield. The nationalist student fraternities that formed at the University of Jena in 1815, young men who had fought in the wars of liberation or been shaped by those who did, adopted these colors as the symbol of German republicanism, democracy, and eventual unification. The black-red-gold appeared at the Hambach Festival in 1832, at the Frankfurt Parliament in 1848, at every significant moment in the long and complicated history of German national aspiration through the 19th century. The Weimar Republic adopted these colors as the national flag in 1919. The Federal Republic of Germany adopted them again in 1949. The flag flying over the Bundestag in Berlin today, the flag that identifies the German state in international forums, on diplomatic buildings, at the Olympics, has its origin in a dye choice made by men who couldn't afford to be issued uniforms. The Völkerschlachtdenkmal, the monument to the Battle of the Nations, stands 91 meters tall in Leipzig, on the ground that was Napoleon's own command post during the battle. It is the largest monument in Europe. Its construction began in 1898 and was completed in 1913. Inaugurated on October 18th of that year, exactly 100 years to the day from the battle's decisive third day. Leipzig's city records document that it stands at the center of the former battlefield, surrounded today by agricultural land and suburban development, where the southern villages of Wachau, Markkleeberg, and Liebert-Volkwitz once saw fighting that changed the map of a continent. The Forum 1813 Museum at the monument's base holds weapons, uniforms, equipment, and personal mementos from the campaign. Tourists can visit daily from 10 in the morning. Most of them stand at the top and look out over the fields without knowing what happened there. That is the nature of history. It becomes landscape. Military historians examining the 1813 campaign tend to converge on a question that has nothing to do with tactics. How did the coalition solve the coalition problem? Every previous coalition against revolutionary and Napoleonic France had assembled, fought, and fractured. The first coalition failed in 1797, the second in 1802, the third at Austerlitz in 1805, the fourth at Tilsit in 1807, the fifth at Wagram in 1809. Each time, Napoleon had exploited the diplomatic divisions within the coalition, finding the bilateral suspicions, the competing territorial ambitions, the leaders who could be separately negotiated with, before those divisions could be translated into military cooperation. His genius was not merely tactical, and it was his ability to identify which alliance was most fragile and apply pressure precisely there. The Sixth Coalition survived because it refused to behave like its predecessors. The treaties of Kalisz, Reichenbach, and Pleswitz created a diplomatic architecture, a series of legally binding mutual commitments with specific military thresholds and agreed war aims that made unilateral negotiation genuinely difficult. British financial subsidies flowing to Russia and Prussia through the Reichenbach Conventions gave those powers an institutional stake in maintaining the alliance's unity. And Schwarzenberg's management of three monarchs with competing interests, Tsar Alexander's divine mission grandiosity, King Frederick William's Prussian dynastic ambitions, the Emperor Francis's Habsburg strategic caution, represented a diplomatic achievement that multiple historians have identified as equal in importance to any battlefield outcome. Schwarzenberg was not a brilliant tactician. He was a brilliant coalition manager, which in 1813 was what the coalition needed. The Trachenberg Plan's military contribution sits alongside this diplomatic achievement. The plan addressed a specific problem that no previous coalition strategy had confronted directly. How do you defeat a commander of Napoleon's caliber when direct engagement simply produces defeat? The answer Bernadot, Radetzky, and Toll arrived at was to move the war away from the level at which Napoleon's genius operated. His genius was tactical. The battlefield, the moment of decision, the management of forces in contact with an enemy. The Trachenberg Protocol denied him that terrain. It moved the conflict to an operational level, sustained campaign management across multiple fronts over months, where Napoleon's reliance on subordinates who couldn't match his expectations became the decisive vulnerability. The German campaign Wikipedia article identifies this explicitly as a Fabian strategy. The deliberate avoidance of decisive engagement while systematically attriting the enemy's capacity for sustained operations. Applied at the scale of 1813 against the specific command architecture that Napoleon had created, it was devastatingly effective. 4 marshal defeats in 6 weeks, Grossbeeren, Katzbach, Kulm, Dennewitz, were not accidents. They were the predictable result of applying superior operational coherence against inferior subordinate leadership. The command structure lesson is the one that subsequent military theory took most seriously. Napoleon's centralized genius had been both the strength and the vulnerability of the French system. Exceptional when he was present, fragile when he was absent. Modern military doctrine's emphasis on decentralized command, the development of officers capable of independent operational judgment, the institutionalization of initiative within established doctrine rather than dependence on personal genius, addresses precisely the problem that the Trachenberg Plan exploited. You cannot build an army that functions only when one specific individual is present on the decisive ground. And the army that loses its effectiveness when its commander is absent has already built its defeat into its structure. The coalition model that defeated Napoleon at Leipzig became a template. The concert of Europe that emerged from the Congress of Vienna applied the same principle to peacetime. Great powers maintaining regular consultation, committing to mutual frameworks rather than pursuing unilateral advantage, treating the system's stability as a shared interest worth preserving. The NATO alliance that emerged after 1945, nations of historically competitive interests bound by treaty with committed military thresholds and agreed collective responses, draws on the same institutional architecture, refined by additional experience. The men who sat at Trachenberg in July of 1813 did not invent collective security, but they demonstrated, for the first time against the most difficult possible opponent, that collective security could work. We promised at the beginning an answer to the question that has occupied historians for 2 centuries. Why did Napoleon, winning with the initiative in his hands, accept the armistice of Pleswitz in June of 1813 and voluntarily stop fighting? The military logic has already been established. His army was genuinely exhausted. His cavalry was critically depleted. His young conscripts were deteriorating physically. The armistice offered time for reinforcement, recuperation, and resupply. These were real military requirements. And historians who examine the campaign without ideological commitment to either praising or condemning Napoleon acknowledge them. Napoleon.org's analysis of the 1813 campaign notes that the French were in dire need of a period of reconstruction and recuperation, a judgment that doesn't require hindsight to be accurate. Anyone present at Lutzen and Bautzen and counting the cavalry losses would have identified the same problem. The strategic miscalculation was in the assumption that the pause would benefit France more than the coalition. This assumption was wrong in every verifiable dimension. The coalition completed Austrian mobilization during those 6 weeks. The decisive geopolitical transformation that converted a two-front war into encirclement. British subsidies reached full activation, like the Prussian Landwehr finished its initial training. The Trachenberg Conference produced its operational plan. Napoleon received a modest cavalry reinforcement and some additional conscripts. The asymmetry of what each side gained from 6 weeks of armistice is not ambiguous in retrospect. It was catastrophic for France. The deeper question, the psychological one, the human one, does not yield to the same analysis. Napoleon's own words from the Metternich meeting at Dresden, as recorded in Metternich's memoir, a source that requires the consistent caveat that Metternich wrote it years later and had substantial reason to portray Napoleon as unraveling, offer something relevant. My domination will not survive me. From the day I ceased to be strong and therefore feared. If those words reflect something Napoleon actually believed, they suggest a man who understood, at some level, that his power was entirely dependent on the perception of invincibility, and that any negotiated settlement acknowledging limits was tantamount to admitting the beginning of the end. That understanding, if genuine, would explain the refusal to negotiate at Dresden in a way that pure strategic calculation does not. It also raises a harder question. If Napoleon knew that accepting terms meant admitting weakness, and admitting weakness meant beginning the end, then why did he accept the armistice that summer? The armistice was not terms, it was a pause. But it was still a cessation of offensive operations at a moment when the initiative was his. It was still, by his own tactical doctrine, the cardinal sin of giving a defeated enemy time to recover. What historians can establish is the verdict, but not the full explanation. His St. Helena reflections, documented through secondary accounts of his exile conversations, identified the armistice as one of the worst decisions of his career. He did not, apparently, fully explain to his own satisfaction why he had made it. Perhaps the most honest assessment available is the one that military biography eventually arrives at for every commander of genius who makes a catastrophic error. He was human. Genius has limits, even Napoleon's. The capacity to process the military situation with extraordinary clarity does not guarantee clarity about one's own psychology, one's own exhaustion, or the moment when the performance of invincibility finally costs more than the performance can sustain. The armistice in June, the single bridge in October, is 2 decisions separated by 4 months, connected by the same structural reality. An emperor who had built a system that worked brilliantly when he was at his best, and that had no resilience for the moments when he wasn't. Leipzig proved what happened when those moments arrived at scale. We began with a bridge. We end with one. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon on October 19th, 1813, 30,000 French soldiers were standing on the wrong bank of the White Elster River, through no fault of their own. They had crossed the Rhine full of whatever mix of fear and patriotism and resignation young men carry into campaigns they didn't choose. They had marched across Germany in summer heat and autumn rain. Many of them had trained for 2 weeks. Some of them were 14 years old, when they had survived 4 days of the largest battle in European history to that point. Artillery that never stopped, village fighting that changed hands 7 times, the Saxon defection that turned colleagues into enemies. They were retreating in good order. They were 60 meters from safety. Then the corporal pulled the lever. The 400,000 French soldiers who campaigned in Germany in 1813 came home as 70,000. The rest, in the frozen arithmetic of campaign accounting, are distributed across 4 causes: killed in battle, died of typhus and paratyphoid, and relapsing fever in the campaign's camps and hospitals, captured and imprisoned, or left in garrisons that Leipzig had already doomed. Behind each of those numbers is what they always are behind numbers of this kind: a family in a French village waiting for a letter that eventually didn't come or came wrong. Marshal Poniatowski, the only foreigner Napoleon ever made a marshal, kept his oath and drowned. The King of Saxony lost most of his kingdom for his loyalty. Leipzig's civilian population lost 10% of its people to typhus in the weeks after the battle was over. The corporal who detonated the bridge, whose name is not established in the mainstream historical record despite some accounts' attempts to identify him, has no monument anywhere. What does have monuments are the consequences. The Völkerschlachtdenkmal stands 91 meters tall in Leipzig today on Napoleon's own former command post. The largest monument in Europe, inaugurated on October 18, 1913. Exactly 100 years from the battle's decisive day. The Federal Republic of Germany flies black, red, and gold over the Bundestag in Berlin. Colors chosen by volunteers who couldn't afford proper uniforms, adopted by student idealists who wanted a unified nation, surviving through Weimar and catastrophe and partition and reunification to fly still. The collective security frameworks that trace their institutional lineage to the Trachenberg model underpin the alliance architecture of the 21st century. And the lesson that Leipzig teaches, the one the Trachenberg plan demonstrated and the armistice illustrated from the opposite direction, is not primarily military. It is the limit of individual genius as a basis for any system that must outlast the individual. Napoleon could not be replaced. Everything he built that depended on him personally being present, being at his best, being irreplaceable, the tactical decisions, the operational vision, the authority that held the marshals in line, was always one absence away from collapse. The Trachenberg plan found that absence and systematically widened it. The greatest military mind of his age lost Germany not because he was outgeneraled at Leipzig. He lost it because he had built a system with one irreplaceable component, and because at the one moment when that component needed to function perfectly, June of 1813, with the initiative in his hands and the coalition still forming, it failed. Not through incompetence, not through cowardice, through the ordinary human limits that genius does not, in the end, exempt anyone from. 70,000 survivors crossed the Rhine in November of 1813. They came home to a France that was about to be invaded for the first time in 20 years. They brought the typhus with them. The bridge was already gone.